the biggest overall challenge for me was, bringing my Spanish up to a level that was good, that I could do, read and then eventually give interviews and so on in Spanish. And I regret a little bit, like we've moved on to other topics, and I regret a little bit that I'm not still in that world.
And remember when I was a student, no, when I was traveling in Mexico in the countryside, someone came to show me his bodega and he said, "This is the stuff I work with. I'm a ranchero." And he was showing me his lasso and his hat and his chapaderas and his saddle. And I thought, oh, what an interesting borrowing from American culture. And when I was in the southern United States and read about the cowboy culture, to discover that the entire U.S. cowboy culture is borrowed from Mexico. The case of Portuguese is different because it's more the realization that a single country, which is Brazil, would be 10 times bigger than Portugal. The case of Spanish is more polycentric than that. And it is true that a lot of the drive for pushing in Madrid the pan-Hispanic perspective is showing to its own nation how great Spanish is. And so that is an element that is absent also.
¿Habéis pensado alguna vez de dónde surgió la palabra español? ¿O habéis pensado cómo ha evolucionado la lengua española? ¿O habéis pensado alguna vez qué impacto ha tenido español en todo el mundo? Pues precisamente para contestar estas preguntas, tengo hoy la gran ilusión de tener conmigo unos invitados muy especiales. Hoy tengo conmigo Jean-Benoît Nadeau y Julie Barlow, autores canadienses que han escrito un libro magnífico que se llama The Story of Spanish. Es un libro excelente para entender la historia de la lengua española y por eso es un gran placer para mí tener con nosotros en mi canal de YouTube Español por dentro los autores de este libro, Jean-Benoît Nadeau y Julie Barlow. Y ellos no hablan español, así que vamos a hablar en inglés. So, Jean and Julie, thank you so much for being here.
You're very welcome. Hablo español.
Buenas tardes.
Pero
Qué
no
bien.
para hacer entrevistas en español.
Bueno, pues.
Tienes razón.
Lo mismo para mí.
Okay, great. So, I have done certain interviews in English on my channel, although this channel is specifically dedicated to Spanish, but for the benefit of a larger audience and a larger pool of people who would love to hear you both, I think it's fantastic that we are able to do this in English. So, firstly, Jean and Julie, I'm so excited to have you both. Thank you so much for giving me your time.
Thank you. You're very welcome. And your Spanish sounds excellent. So congratulations. How long have you been speaking?
Well, it's been more than 17 years that I've been studying, teaching, learning, doing everything related to Spanish. So, I mean, that's the love of my life and my passion. So, yeah.
Nice.
So we will refrain, being journalists, we will refrain from asking questions, and we will instead answer yours.
You are the guests on this show, so I will be asking you questions, but feel free to pitch in and ask me back anything that you would love to. Yeah. So, as I told in the introduction, this is a fantastic book that I recommend people who love reading about languages, who love reading about Spain, about the history of Spanish language, culture, society, everything. Language is something that holds no bars and involves everything within it. So I think from that perspective, Julie and Jean, you've done an excellent job of coming out with this book for lovers of Spanish language like me. It's an absolute blessing and great to have you. So once again, thank you so much for coming on this channel.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so for the benefit of people who may not know Jean and Julie, they are Canadian authors and journalists known for their works exploring language, culture, and society, particularly in the Francophone world. The duo often collaborates on books and articles that delve into linguistic topics, cultural differences, and history of French and, dare I say, history of Spanish as well. Their notable works include 60 Million Frenchmen Can't Be Wrong, which examines, it's a very catchy title, which examines French culture and society, demystifying stereotypes about the French way of life. The Story of French, a comprehensive exploration of history and global influence of the French language. The Bonjour Effect, which discusses how languages shape French behavior and culture with a focus on communication styles. And of course, amongst many of those other books is this book that we're going to talk about today, the Story of Spanish, La Historia del Español. Through their engaging and insightful writing, Nadeau and Barlow have gained recognition for making complex linguistic and cultural phenomena accessible to general readers. They often weave humor and anecdotal evidence into their work, making their books both informative and entertaining. So, and I can vouch for that, having read this book, that all of those elements are there in this book. And we're going to talk a little bit about them, or maybe a lot about them in detail as we go along. So, Jean and Julie, my first question to both of you is, what inspired you to write a comprehensive history of the Spanish language?
Big question.
Well,
I mean, as you explained in your introduction, we work on language, and we began our adventure with, of course, the book of the similar name, The Story of French. And, it was just such a journey to write that book. And we just wanted to do it all over again, honestly. And Spanish seemed like we'd always been intrigued by Spanish. We both had learned a bit of Spanish. We wanted to learn more. We wanted to really, really dive into that world. And, we were looking for, we just wanted to understand where it came from and how similar it was to French, how different it was from French. I mean, that was really the framework we started with. But then it led in quite a different direction. Although, as we'll discuss, there are very similar elements that shape the story of a language. I guess the other element was, and it's a curious part of the book, and I'm not sure it came through to you. We lived in the United States, and the Spanish language has a very interesting destiny in that country. And we were understanding that at that point, the United States was actually becoming an influential player in the world of Spanish language politics. So we made living in the United States and living inside of that really very much part of the research for the book. And that was fun. I mean, we're always looking for excuses to go on the road and figure things out. So we did a fair bit of traveling. Jean, can talk a little bit more. You were in Spain.
Julie's experience with Spanish was Mexico and Spain. She learned Spanish in Mexico. In fact, her mother tongue is English. She had learned French in Quebec. And in Mexico, they called her La Francesa.
Because I spoke with a French accent, imagine.
She spoke Spanish with a French accent, even if English is her mother tongue. Yeah. My contact with Spanish was mostly through Mexico and a bit of Nicaragua. This had to do with the fact that when I was a student, I was involved with 2 speleological expeditions of Quebecers in Mexico, long ones at that. And so my contact with Spanish culture, and I also made a trip when I was 16 for 2 or 3 weeks, a camping trip in Mexico with a travel agency where we travel. So my contact was always Mexico, and always mostly, in fact, the countryside. And so I discovered Spanish after that through school and McGill University, and became quite fluent. Unlearned a fair amount after that, but so that's my contact with that culture, and then later Spain, naturally. Yeah.
Wow, wonderful, fascinating. And I'd like to ask you now, how did the process of researching the book, because this is, I mean, the first thing that struck me while reading this book was the amount of research that had been done, and the kind of interactions you had with people. So how did this process of researching the book change your perspective on the evolution of Spanish? I would like to get a little bit deeper into your minds and try to understand how did you look at language before you started writing this book, and how did your perspective probably change or evolve for the better or for worse while writing this book?
Well, I don't know if our perspective on language per se changed much writing this book. Certainly there were surprises in the book, and we can talk about that. There were surprising figures in the book. The way Spanish is regulated in the world was fascinating to us. Like French and Spanish do not have the same outlook. French is a language that's very much dominated by a single country of its origin that sort of has some kind of authority over the world, although that's changing. Spanish, on the other hand, is a very the authority of Spanish is not as much concentrated in Spain in the same way. And that goes back to early, that's not recent. That's been part of the way that the language has evolved. And of course, the number of Spanish speakers far outstrips the number that speak in Spain. I mean, it's just a completely different dynamic. That was one of the big, shifts in how we looked at language. But I've got to say, one of the things that surprised me the most was, in some ways, how similar the story of the evolution of a language is. Like they started out as French and Spanish as Roman Latin dialects to some extent, and then were influenced by the different languages that they came in contact with for different historical reasons. And it's really fun, to look at, the Visigoths and the Arab influence and, now English and everything. And those forces are playing on Spanish throughout its history, really from its very earliest history, and in French. And then you see that both languages have these personalities. Like in French, it's like François Premier. They just decide to take charge of the language and make it the tool of something, and then in Spanish you have the same thing, but in Spanish you had it even earlier with Alfonso
el Sabio.
I mean, just like these people who just in history just decide to make the language something. And so there's this interaction of forces between, contact with other languages, these seminal, incredible figures who do the things that really set the language on the path to where it's going, to reach its destiny. Wars, struggles, politics, of course, all of that plays a role in it. And then, interestingly, the old, giving people a good reason to learn. That's always been, people tend to look at languages with a bit of a Machiavellian outlook, like somebody's pushing this language here or pushing that. But the spread of languages is mostly about, I would say, you can say what you think about this. It's a lot about incentives and what's in it for me, So in the early part of the language, you'll see, and you've read, you'll see that, language, Latin dialects that will eventually be becoming Spanish are really resistant to, the Arabs don't wipe them out. The Visigoths, people can't get rid of this thing. And it's interesting because language pops up and becomes useful for people, and it's a language of trade, it's a language of commerce, it gives them contact to the outside world, and those things really stay in the language. So I think, and I was really surprised. I mean, it's similar in Spanish as in French, just different circumstances, obviously different cultures in contact with, and but these same sort of things and these same figures as well.
I was much impressed by that was probably my biggest surprise, was that the Spanish, earlier than the French, developed an idea of a standard through Alfonso, and even Nebrija. Nebrija published his grammar on the same day that Christopher Columbus sailed to the Americas in 1492. It was a complete grammar of Spanish in Spanish. That's something that had not been done about any vernacular language in Europe. So this, contrary to what I had always thought, I'd always thought that the French sort of developed a very early conscious of their culture and language. No, it actually began with the Spanish. And I found that absolutely fascinating. And naturally, when they borrowed from the French the idea of an academy, they gave it a completely different spin, much more professional and linguistic from the start. Well, at the time they would have said philological, And then that idea that they would create an association of that they would create academies throughout the Spanish world, and that they would associate them in a common dictionary project much later. I mean, this was all
It's decentralized.
yeah. And this I found absolutely fascinating. The idea that there's a pan-Hispanismo at the same time that they develop national standards, and all 22 academies of Spanish co-signed the dictionary of the Real Academia Española in Madrid. I mean, this is all fascinating stuff. I mean, to a French speaker who cultivates the idea that you have a false idea that French is like unified language, or to an Anglophone speaker who thinks that a good, healthy language is a language that goes in all sorts of directions where you don't have no authority above it. The story of Spanish is absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, it's like a compromise. It's like right in the middle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
like controlled spread.
Control and spread, but like a notch above control. Like, I mean, and the latest drive for controlling Spanish with the Real Academia and the ASALE, the Asociación de las Academias de la Lengua Española, ASALE, plus the Fundeu, the Fundación del Español Urgente. Absolutely fascinating stuff. I mean, it's mind-boggling how interesting it is.
Yeah, that's fascinating, and that really does come out in the book as well. What you write about this jostling for space of what is the standard variation of Spanish in Spain, and other variations, and that's the beauty of this book. I'd like to tell to my audience that where in this book that you'll find that a lot of space has been given for recognizing the kind of Spanish that is spoken in places like Puerto Rico or Mexico or many other South American countries, which I would like to say, being a Spanish teacher and being a Spanish teacher for a good number of years now, that the textbooks that we used to use earlier, the manuales, as we call them in Spanish, had of course the standard Castellano that is spoken in Spain. That is what we still learn. But earlier in those manuals or in those textbooks, not a lot of space was given to the South American way of speaking Spanish or certain vocabulary used in South American Spanish. But I think as the world has evolved over the last 10 years, 15 years, I think the stronger presence of Latinos in different spheres of life, personalities emerging from different sectors, different walks of life, has sort of made these publishers and writers of these textbooks to start giving recognition to the kind of Spanish that is spoken in South American countries. And
But it's funny, Julie started learning Spanish with telenovelas.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that the development of the telenovelas in the 60s and 70s drove the Academy to change completely its methods of working in order to create a dictionary that would be more pan-Hispanic.
Right.
And this was driven by not completely, but partly by that drive.
Absolutely. In fact, as you talk about telenovelas, I'm reminded of that chapter which you both have dedicated to telenovelas. Probably it comes under the name of The Latin Rage, if I'm not wrong. I'll have to look that in detail because it's been a while since I read the book. But yeah, I mean that's fascinating and wonderful, and that's what the quality of research that you both have brought to this book. The fact that so much of space has been given for recognizing these other variants of Spanish. Moving on, my next question to both of you is, what were the biggest challenges, Julie and Jean, that you encountered while writing about such a vast linguistic and cultural history?
Well, even
some interesting things that
even before even before writing taking on the vastness of it. Of course, there are challenges. I'll talk about that in a second. But I had to really brush up my Spanish. So that was the biggest challenge for me. So I went to Mexico for like extended periods twice, and I studied away and I had a tutor and I worked on it. So, you know, the biggest overall challenge for me was, you know, bringing my Spanish up to a level that was good, that I could do, you know, read and then eventually give interviews and so on in Spanish. And I regret a little bit, like we've moved on to other topics, and I regret a little bit that I'm not still in that world, but we'll go back to it.
Well, we do want to go live in Mexico for 2 or 3 months. That's one of our projects. It will happen in coming years. But the challenge intellectually was, first of all, to find a center in something that has no center. That was quite complicated. When you tell the story of French, for example, you can build it around the fiction of Paris being the center of French, quite a long time. If you wrote a story of English, you could build it around how England passed the ball to the United States. I mean, it's for Spanish, it's a little bit more complicated because it's a polycentric story, and also because we were writing a book that was not just linguistic, but had a lot of sociolinguistics, which meant politics, which meant economics, which meant demographics. We also had to find a structure of book that would actually accommodate all those questions, that would allow us to dig a little bit in each without scattering ourselves too much and being able to make connections. That was a big challenge.
Yeah, writing it was putting together a structure for it was the research itself, you know, like I don't recall, it's going back a little ways. We read and picked stuff up. I mean, I think that the research and knowing what we wanted to do, like identifying the topics, was not that hard. Like I think we always want to find stories that aren't that well known, you know. So that's our journalist side coming through, you know. But I think we centered in on the stories pretty quickly, and then we built a structure about it, you know. And we very much wanted to, you know, as you said, not center it on the sort of classic idea about, you know, of Spain, because it's a world language. I mean, even though it's not spread, interestingly, as widely as, say, French is, like it's you know, the second language speakers are very much more concentrated in South America, not only, but they are. We wanted to find it everywhere, you know, even in the United States. So it was fun. It was really, really fun to research that book.
There was a line of, for example, the prehistory of the language, where it comes from, and from Romance language to Spanish. And then there was another arc that was about how Spanish spread through a strategy mostly of settlement, and with cultural diplomacy arriving very late in the history of Spanish. And the development of a standard of modern Spanish. And we also wanted to have a special emphasis. A particular case we wanted to go into a bit more is that in the spread of Spanish, because our publisher was American, to have more of an arc about the story of Spanish in the United States.
And that was fine. It's really interesting. But one of the things that is challenging, and was challenging, you know, morally somehow, you know, with French and with Spanish, of course, colonialism is what spreads the languages, you know. So I find it hard to write about that in a way that, you know, sounds too rosy. Like, you know, it was a dreadful process spreading Spanish in South America. It was, you know, it involved, you know, in some ways eliminating almost completely populations. And of course, that's one of the reasons that Spanish worked in South America, was because we wasn't up against the same thing, you know.
Although one thing we came up is the idea that, and it is absolutely true historically, is that there was a huge depopulation of a continent, but 90% of that depopulation was not willful. It was not the doing of the Spaniards or the Portuguese themselves. It was the biological shock
which
of two continents that had been isolated for 12,000 years.
yeah.
And there was and this is 90% of what happened. But still,
Yeah, no,
it happened.
it's kind of heart-wrenching to realize like the content had been sort of cleared in some ways of many native languages, that some of which have survived and some of which haven't, but we didn't go, I mean, as you see, we don't
But we go carefully about this, but the same with the presence of Spanish in the United States. The presence of Spanish in the United States is because the United States annexed half of the Mexican territory in 1845. Can't be helped. That's how it started. So but in a way, at the same time, it allows us to say that Spanish is not a foreign language in the United States. It is not. It's a domestic language. And when you talk about, I remember when we were young students, when we talked about Tex-Mex, you remember? We used to say Tex-Mex was a fake food. No, it's the food that was the Mexican food in the United States before it was the United States. And it's sort of the United States got there, and the root of Mexican chili, for example, is Texas, before Texas was American. That's where it came from. And remember when I was a student, no, when I was traveling in Mexico in the countryside, someone came to show me his bodega, and he said, this is the stuff I work with. I'm a ranchero. And he was showing me his lasso and his hat and his chapaderas and his saddle. And I thought, oh, what an interesting borrowing from American culture. And when I was in the southern United States and read about the cowboy culture, to discover that the entire U.S. cowboy culture is borrowed from Mexico. They developed it in the 25, 30 years after Cortes for long range cattle raising was developed in Mexico. They used it as the means of entering the vast territory of what is now the American Southwest. And it was then much later Americanized. But it is profoundly Mexican. And so it's all these things that we found that were just because we had an open eye, not being American, not being it's certain that there are other things we would have understood had we been Spanish or Mexican, but we were from the outside and we were looking for the story.
And I hope it doesn't, like, I hope that comes through in the book. I mean, we're really outsiders. It's not, we're not recognized experts of the Spanish language when we set out to write this. We're not.
Yeah.
But we really wanted that. We really wanted it to be a book of discovery, and combining the research, the journalistic kind of side with the other side.
And the fun of it, the fun of researching it.
Right. It's fascinating what you guys talk about, and probably the fact that you were quote unquote outsiders sort of helped you have a much wider perspective of the language, which and I go back to the fact that so much of research was done on Spanish in South American countries. The variant of Spanish is something that sort of has helped definitely and will help people who read this book to understand and embrace the variants of Spanish that exist in the world. And truly, it is a global language that way. And not just from the perspective of the number of speakers, that when we do the rankings of these languages, but truly in a way, the variation of the gamut of races and castes that exist that speak Spanish is something that is fascinating, and that does definitely come out in the book. My next question to both of you is, how do you think Spanish's evolution compares with other Romance languages like French? I'm sure you'll be able to talk a lot about French, or even Portuguese for that matter, or any other Romance languages.
Well, I mean, I guess I've sort of preempted your question with my answer earlier, about discovering the similar forces that are working on it. Yeah, I'm not sure we've got that much more to add about that.
The main difference would be the very early recognition that it was a polycentric language. That's a big difference with French. The case of Portuguese is different because it's more the realization that a single country, which is Brazil, would be 10 times bigger than Portugal. The case of Spanish is a more polycentric than that. And we should evolve. And their cultural production as well. And also, I would say someone, it's an idea that was given to me in an interview after we published the book, and I regret it's not in the book, but the Madrilen, the people in Madrid are very pan-Hispanic. It's very much so, and much more strongly than in Paris, for example. And there are good economic reasons why, for example, companies like Telefónica or banks like Santander or BBVA were trying to be pan-Hispanic, obviously for expanding their market. But someone said to me, and I think it was the Quebec delegate in Barcelona, he said there's also an element of competition in the United States because in Spain, because the Spanish government is threatened by a very strong separatist movement in Catalonia. And it is true that a lot of the drive for pushing in Madrid the pan-Hispanic perspective is showing to its own nation how great Spanish is. And so that is an element that is absent also. For example, in the story of French, there's no competition in France for French, really. And whereas there is one in Spain.
Yeah. So the big difference is the relative size of the spread of Spanish, the relative size of the sort of historic home of Spanish compared to where it spread and grew. But it's really interesting that those centers create and have control over the language, and that's part of how Spanish is conceived. Where, as opposed to French, where there's this struggle. I mean, I think that the French are getting there in terms of allowing other centers of French to participate in deciding on the norms and the standards of the language. But it's a really big difference in the dynamic of Spanish, and obviously the Spanish-speaking world way outnumbered Spain, so that was similarly to English, but with this dynamic of sharing the control. I think that's I think it's a very enlightened, smart thing for a language. I mean, I think it's very promising for Spanish in the future. I don't know. It's French is struggling with that.
Interesting. You also touched upon the aspect of colonialism a while back, and my next question is related to that. In fact, it is about colonialism. So what role do you believe colonialism played in shaping the different variants of Spanish around the world?
Well, the Spanish, like the Portuguese, had a very strong policy of settlement. I made statistics between, you see, around 1600, there were 4 colonial, or about to be, I mean, France and England had not begun their empire yet, but look at their size. France had about 20 million inhabitants, and the 3 countries, England, Spain, and Portugal, had 5 million each. Okay. At the end of at the time, by 1800, France had sent about 15,000 people to New France and Acadia. That's very little with respect to its population. Spain had sent 25 times that number, for a country that was only the quarter of the size. Even England had never sent more than 150,000 people in the 13 colonies. And Spain sent 500,000. It was a huge drain of population. And this is not counting. We have a chapter on this. The Jews and the Muslims that were expelled from Spain. that was also a tremendous drain on the population and did spread a
Dialect of
variant,
Spanish.
a
Yeah.
dialect of Spanish, especially the Jews. It's called Ladino, and it's
Mhm.
still spoken a bit in France and a bit in Israel nowadays. But it is, when you listen to it and read it, an old version of Spanish, but that evolved in its own way. And so Spain had a tremendous, effort, almost bleeding people. I
Mhm.
mean, and this had a huge impact on how the language is spread, because Spanish, contrary to French, is dominated by maternal language speakers. Like 80% of people in the Spanish sphere are as Spanish as a mother tongue, not as a second language. It's the opposite profile
Mhm.
of
Yeah.
French and
Yeah.
English.
That's one of the interesting.
And that's a very strong element of the profile of that language as an international language. And it comes from a policy of settlement and emigration from Spain in large numbers.
Okay, interesting. My next question to you is, can you share any surprising facts or discoveries that you found during your research that sort of, it just made you sort of take note of that?
Oh, there were so many.
Yeah.
We've spoken about a lot of them. What else?
Well, there's a finding that the name Hispania
Yes.
comes
Yeah.
from the Phoenician, which meant
Yeah.
the land of rabbits,
rabbits, that's
according
hilarious.
to some theories.
Yeah, that's
Because
hilarious.
the first Phoenician who arrived that we're talking 1,000 years before
Mhm.
Jesus Christ, before our era, found a lot of rabbits. Well, they were not rabbits. They were
Yeah.
something similar.
Yeah.
Right.
And they called it the land of rabbits. That was in what would become eventually Andalusia. My other big surprise was the origin of the dollar sign.
Oh yeah.
I remember being
Yeah.
in Mexico when I was young, and they wrote 1,000 pesos with a dollar sign. I said, "Oh, what a weird thing to have borrowed the American dollar sign for peso." It's the other way around. The pesos, the dollar sign is a part of the herald of Spain, with
Mhm.
the two columns of Gibraltar with the drape swirling around it.
Mhm.
And it's the two columns and the dollar sign. And people would write a peso like two columns and the swirl. That's how they wrote it. And then it spread to the dollar. It spread from the peso to the dollar because the Spanish had developed huge mines of silver in Mexico. And the Spanish dollar, or what was called in those times the pieza de ocho eight, a ocho, the pieza de a ocho, or the pieces of eight, later to be called, was a dollar that became the standard in the world. In fact, when the United States were created, the Spanish dollar was traded at par with the American dollar, which was mimicked on the Spanish dollar. And the Spanish dollar was used everywhere in the world as a money of reference. So much so that when they created the New York Stock Exchange, the dollars were not, when people traded shares, they traded them in dollars and in eights. Why eights and not tens or cents? It's because it was the piece of eight. That was the currency, the international currency of reference at the time that they created the American Stock Exchange. Still, and it kept until 1993 when they dollarized in the end the American Stock Exchange and created the dollar, and mind-boggling that we had. We're so Americanized that we actually do not recognize the actual Spanish origin of the dollar sign and what followed from it. Mind-boggling.
Fantastic. Anything, Julie, that you'd like to add to this?
No, no, no. I was just trying to think of the other things that, that there were some, but the Ishpana was
Yeah.
Shepana, yeah.
discovering that
Yeah.
its name came from the
I
Phoenician.
was just looking at it that those animals were called hyrax,
Yes.
and
Yes.
yeah,
Yeah, we call
and
them rabbits.
they look like rabbits. So yeah, I mean that's also, that's right there in the first chapter, the land of the rabbits. So when I bought the book and I went through the titles of the chapters, I was just looking at it and saying, like, what's with the
What the
rabbits,
heck?
Yeah. I mean, having
Well,
taught
that was
Spanish,
that was
I,
deliberate. We wanted to like surprise people. I hope we didn't
yeah,
turn people off. In the end, we may have just said, who are these people writing a book about rabbits anyway? Those are the choices
yeah,
we
no,
make
that
as
was
writers to try and grab the attention of people.
absolutely, absolutely, and
Yeah.
and you were successful, at least with me, and I'm sure with
Thank you.
with many, many more as well. My next
Mm.
question then, to both of you, is about, in your opinion, what has contributed most to the spread of Spanish in the modern world? I know it's a tough question to answer, because the fact that you cannot probably single out any one particular aspect, but if you were to point a finger on any one aspect that you felt contributed most to the spread of Spanish in the modern world, what could that
Yeah.
be?
Well, there's, the whole book is about all the factors that made it a world language, of course. But right now, I'm not following the growth of the growth of number of Spanish speakers in the world right now, the way we are the growth of French speakers. But I'll tell you, at the moment, it's not very complicated. There are two things. First of all, population growth is explaining the growth of French as a second language,
Mhm.
and I assume that that's the same with Spanish as well.
Mhm.
Population growth is not happening significantly in North America for French the way it is in Africa. So, French is really growing as a world language because of its presence in Africa. So I assume that's also the case of Spanish. But again, I'm not following the statistics, but
Mhm.
it's not that complicated
Mhm.
now. As far as the continuing growth of the language, one of the factors, this very successful, vibrant television and film industry in Spanish language is, not hurting the spread of Spanish. I would, if I were to look at this topic right now, that's what I would be looking into.
Yeah.
Because the telenovelas are incredibly successful and incredibly widespread, and people watch them in all kinds of languages. I don't know if you watched, not even telenovelas, but the Spanish series that was so popular on Netflix. This name is not coming to me.
La
Um,
Fea Baby?
No,
uh,
no, no,
No?
no, no.
the Money Heist.
Yes, Money Heist.
Yeah,
That was
yeah,
No,
wildly
more
successful.
recently, yes.
yeah.
So,
Mhm.
we're seeing a lot of that stuff. The other thing I would say is, it's interesting because when we were even back writing our first book on French, people were all sort of talking about how internet was going to bring the dominance of English in the world, and that's not untrue, but it's not exactly the truth either. Um, Internet has been a big boon for all languages, and the last time I looked at statistics, the higher the percentage was of other languages with respect to English. It's permitted communities to be in contact and flourish, and like a community of languages worldwide is, English is not hurting that right now. Internet and social media are helping that, I think. So, but to be perfectly honest, I don't have. We were writing these books, and I don't know. Do you know any more recently about that? It's like the idea that technology would ruin other languages with respect to English was not panning out. It was working the other way.
I would say in the last 50 years is short in the history of a language, and it's long at the same time. You have
Yeah.
evolution of the language itself, but I would say the two bigger, two other big trends of the last 50 years is the development of cultural diplomacy by Spain. They
Mhm.
got out of Frankism and they started the Instituto Cervantes and a lot of tools of cultural diplomacy that helped a lot. And the development of Spanish in the United States. The United States being dominant in the dominant communicator in globalization, the rise of Spanish in the United States has had a tremendous effect on the visibility of the
Mhm.
Spanish language worldwide.
Mhm.
And I think that conversely,
Yeah.
it may suffer with
Trump.
Trump in the coming years. But
It's crazy because what we realized living there was you first of all you can't live your life in Spanish in some parts of the United States and not speak English. I'm not saying that's good, but it was possible back then. And there was so much energy and so much community and so much spirit towards, you know, I don't know if accommodating is the right word, but you know, Spanish, one of the big differences between Spanish and French is that people learn French because of a certain attraction to the culture. I'm speaking broadly, like and an ideal, and they want to sort of be part of this fantasy that the French project in their cultural diplomacy. Spanish is a practical language, at least here and in the United States. It's something people wanted to learn to be able to work with immigrants, help immigrants, you know,
yeah,
settle
the
and
United
in the
States.
United States.
Mhm.
And so that was really yeah, like a big
Yeah,
big
the drive
difference.
the drive was interesting, and but at the same time, because Spanish is quite important in the United States, it projects something
To the rest of the
everywhere,
world. Yeah. Now, of course,
and
all that might change now.
all that might change again.
It's hard. It's hard now. You know, it's been a while since we lived there, but it's really hard to imagine how that expulsion of broad expulsion of immigrants, mostly Mexican, is going to pan out.
Which may not happen,
Which
but
may
we
not
don't
happen
know.
because they're so much part of the fabric of the society. I mean, it's really shocking to think about how it's going to happen and what it's going to do.
Mm.
But I don't think it's going to stop people from learning Spanish, and you know, I don't think it's going to hurt Spanish in the United States. Do you? I mean,
I don't know. It's hard to tell. Yeah,
yeah.
but there will still be televisions,
There's still
newspapers.
going to be business to do in Spanish and money to make in Spanish.
The
People are
truth
gonna,
is that in the
people are
United
gonna,
States, Spanish is an American language.
it is. Yeah,
It's an
Yeah,
American language, it's a local language.
yeah.
true,
But
true.
so interesting that the difference between the group of people who promote French and the group who promote Spanish. Like
Yeah.
it's really two different things completely, and we weren't completely prepared for that. It took us a while to get our heads around it. Anyway.
Mm. It's interesting, and being an Indian, I would like to say I don't know whether you've had time to sort of delve into India as a country of Spanish speaking people, because I'd like to tell you both that I mean, Instituto Cervantes, unlike say the Orleans Francais or Max Miller, which are the two cultural centers of languages promoting their, the government backing that it has. So Instituto Cervantes, as compared to these two institutes, they came much later. In India,
Mhm.
I think they came in only in 2009, so it's not been that long a time. But I'd like to tell you both that. Spanish is now probably, I mean, I don't have the statistics to back that up, but I can say with a fair degree of confidence from just looking at the sheer number of students that study in schools and universities in India and the number of departments for Spanish language that have opened up in across universities, both in government as well as private sector in India. Spanish
Mhm.
is a very hot language, and it has been hot since the last many years. And in fact, a survey of Instituto Cervantes showed a few years ago that the New Delhi branch of Instituto Cervantes has the highest footfall of students across all its centers in the world.
Huh.
And
Wow. So
I'm
interesting.
yeah, and that
What
something that you can delve into and see, because I see being a Spanish teacher in a school, we have about 400 students studying Spanish, as
okay.
compared to probably just about 200 in French. And this is the
Huh.
kind of ratio in a lot of international schools in across India. A lot of uh, the students are learning, people are learning Spanish to become Spanish teachers, because there are a lot of opportunities to become Spanish teachers and get good pay in schools and as well as
Mm.
universities. And
Can
it's
I
it's
ask why? I mean, what do you think makes people so attracted to Spanish in
so
India?
there are many reasons. If I talk about kids, especially if I start with them, kids aged 6 to 14 or 15, of course, they love Messi, they love Shakira, they love all these all these, especially the sports people and even actors and actresses and singers. Latin songs are very popular in India. Recently the rage was Despacito. I'm sure now there are many other songs like that come from time to time and draw the attention of the kids. So they learn Spanish because of that. And if I talk about the next category of people in the age group of say 18 to 25 or 30, I mean, some purely for the love of the language, some for mostly others for reasons of job, because there are a lot of companies, Spanish companies that are there in India, and
Okay.
not just Spanish, a lot of Latin American countries, because India of late has started to have a stronger relations with bilateral relations with Latin American countries like Mexico, Colombia, Peru, Bolivia, and a lot of Indian companies have been set up there. Companies like Tata and HCL. These are some of the well-known companies that have a good presence in
Mhm.
countries like Colombia. So yeah, I
Hmm.
mean, job perspectives and much more. A lot of students are now going to Spain to study as well. I mean,
Okay.
still a lot of Indians go to places like US, UK, Canada, New Zealand, and all. But then there are quite a few students now who are coming up and going to Spain to study, or probably going to US. And the fact that in US Spanish is the language spoken, so they are studying
Mhm.
because of that as well. So yeah, I mean,
Well, it sounds like you have, answered better than we can.
But
Your question number 10 about about how globalization is affecting Spanish. I mean, that's a very good example. And if we were
yeah, no,
rewriting a book,
I mean, I just wanted to I just
yeah.
wanted to sort of touch upon this topic because, while I was reading the book, I was, for some reason, for maybe the naivety in me, I was just sort of expecting that will Julie and Jean talk about India at some point of time in the
Yeah.
book.
yeah,
Well,
So
we would now,
but
but
we wrote the book. We researched the book in 2010, 11, when India just appeared on the radar of the Instituto Cervantes. I mean, it was just beginning.
yeah,
So
2009
the
was when
changes you
Cervantes came.
describe are recent. I would say that from the perspective of teaching and learning, Spanish has great advantages. It's a
yeah,
language
yeah.
and it's a vocalic language, which is alternates of consonants and vowels. But more importantly, it has it is not completely phonetic, but it has a relatively simple spelling, much less atrocious than English or French. English is terrible. And it has a completely transparent grammar. If you speak Spanish correctly, the grammar itself is corresponds to what you say. Whereas in French, for example, French is awful for that because it has a completely silent grammar. And in fact, dyslexia is most common amongst speakers of French and English because of the spelling. So
Hmm.
Spanish Spanish has, from the perspective of teaching it, I wouldn't say it's easy.
No, I
That's not
wouldn't.
it.
No.
But when you're a learner, it's very encouraging. I went through it, and it's very encouraging because you can learn Spanish very fast
Yeah,
from hearing it, and you
Yeah.
can gain a lot of
yeah.
ground
Mind you,
very quickly.
we were both coming from French, so
Yes,
similar
but
structures, and
Yeah.
yes, but
we weren't
No,
coming from
I
Japan.
think one of this one of this the when you talk about from the point of grammar, it's easy, but then there are a lot of grammatical concepts in Spanish that people, especially in India, find it very hard. For example, the aspects of the verb to be, which is ser and estar, and
Mhm.
people find it hard to sort of comprehend this, especially and because of the fact that we in India are very English centric as well. English for us is almost a regional language
Yeah.
and not a foreign language, thanks to the rule of the Britishers for more than 200 years. So we are, I mean, we are born and brought up, raised in an English environment, at least in the urban centers of India. So
Mhm.
and so ser and estar is a topic. another one is,
It's
the
tough for
two,
everybody though. It was tough for me, wasn't it? Seconds are
I
tough.
understood better this. We have in French, we have a subjunctive mode, like in
subjunctive,
Spanish.
yeah,
But I really understood the French subjunctive when I studied the Spanish subjunctive because it's absolutely clear.
yeah,
And in fact, it brings nuances that you cannot even have in French because the subjunctive sometimes is silent
yeah.
and in French, whereas it's absolutely audible in English, in Spanish.
Yeah, subjunctive is another topic that has a lot of students scratching their head around trying to come to terms with it because we don't have probably a subjunctive mode in English. But interestingly, we do have a subjunctive mode in one of our regional languages, which is Hindi, which is the language spoken in northern part of India.
Yeah,
Also, the two variants of past tense, the imperfecto and the indefinido, the preterite tense, is something that even as a teacher, it can get a bit ambiguous in certain scenarios. So Spanish grammar does have its own share of ambiguities that we need to deal with as teachers when we are teaching. So I mean, but that's the fun of teaching such a
yeah.
beautiful language.
Nice.
The truth is that all languages do have their strengths and complications. But for a learner, beginning Spanish, very rewarding. You can progress very quickly and get to a B1 level because there's a transparency in it but yeah, but indeed, the subjunctive may be an issue
Right.
if you're not
Yeah.
familiar.
True.
But for francophone, for example, the preterito in Spanish, absolutely weird because we do have a simple past in
Simple
French,
past.
but it's actually a literary tense that nobody uses in speaking.
Mm.
So for a francophone, learn that is a difficulty when you learn Spanish because we do not use the simple past in the same way.
Yeah.
And okay, and the fact that, for example, the subject of a verb is the pronoun is not necessary. Hablo is I speak.
Yeah.
Right.
If I say
Right.
yo hablo is
Yeah.
me, I speak.
Yeah.
So it's okay.
Yeah,
Anyway,
there are many more that come to my mind, but I guess we need to move on to the next question. And my next question to both Jean and Julie is how do you see the influence of indigenous languages? Because when I was reading this book, you have sort of written a lot about the indigenous languages in South America. So how much do the influence of indigenous languages on Spanish is happen in countries, especially in countries like Mexico and Peru? How much do you see the influence of these languages on
I
the
would,
Castellano?
I don't know, we would have to return and see what happened to now what, for instance.
well, now what is still the largest
Yeah.
largest native language of the Americas.
But how is it surviving compared to when you,
I think it's doing fine,
Okay.
I
from
think
my
I think it's doing
understanding.
fine because I recently did an interview with someone who is an authority on Nahuatl and I think they are sort of trying to revive it and yeah they're sort
Yeah.
of doing it well.
yeah,
Mm.
it's not an area we're particularly specialists in. Yeah,
Okay.
Well, the Mexicans, the Spanish, for all sorts of reason, came across the two largest cultures of that
Yeah.
continent, which is the Peru, the Inca Empire and the Aztec Empire, and those were tremendously populated civilizations. And they did borrow at the time they did borrow massive amount of vocabulary from
Yeah.
those two
Yeah,
groups.
that's true. Yeah.
And my big surprise was how close it was when those two countries that during all the colonial period, these two languages, which is Quechua and Nahuatl in particular, progressed in those parts of the Spanish Empire at the expense of the other native languages in parallel to Spanish as a middle language. And it was a close call when those countries became independent that they became Spanish speaking rather than Nahuatl speaking or Quechua as official language. But it was a close call in 1830, 1850. The bets were out. They were still strong languages there. Surprisingly, that was my one of my big surprises. But I think Quechua is doing well as well.
Is it? Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
Okay.
possibly back to what I was saying earlier about, the way that technology is to some extent helping
Yeah.
keep languages alive,
Right,
against
right.
what many people believed.
Right. My next question is, what do you think the future holds for the Spanish language as it continues to grow globally? I know we've spoken quite a lot about it. I have also talked about, certain aspects of Spanish language from the perspective of India. But how do you,
Well,
as authors of this book, see the
Yeah.
future?
Well, we're looking at seeing the future when we finish the book, which was quite some time ago. And to be fair, we haven't been following again like statistics on the growth of the languages. I suspect you may have more to say in some ways than we do. The future looked very positive and optimistic when we were writing this book. It didn't look like Spanish was under any kind of threat. I mean, at the time, people really were talking about English as some sort of language that was going to take over and eliminate languages, but that's not turning out to be true.
No.
People are learning English, but it's not eliminating any language. So I think, with many of the reasons that we've spoken, Spanish has the pieces in place to be flourishing. The United States is a big question mark, of course, and it was becoming a major player at the time we wrote the book. It's a big question mark of what's going to happen, but it could, that kind of political move that looks like it's going to happen may have exactly the opposite effect. It may put the language front and center and bring people out of the woods and get people talking about, the real role of Spanish in the United States, which is a big one. It's kind of like little held under the rug, a little swept under the rug, but it's an important language. I assume that as I mentioned, the cultural production is from what I can see anecdotally, very strong. But again, I'm not an expert in that. What are the other vectors? The globalization, as you mentioned, that all has an effect. People learn Spanish because they need it. It's going to be useful. It's going to help them earn their living, or they want access to great cultural goods that are coming out of Spain, and that's going.
There are not that many. When you look at the statistics on languages in the world, there's about 5,000 or 6,000 languages. Some people say 7. Let's say 6,000. There's the number of languages that are spoken by more than 5 million people is exactly 110.
Yeah.
Only 110 languages are spoken by more than 5 million people, and only 10 languages are spoken by more than 100 million people. And Spanish is one of those. And in the last century and a half, as empires collapsed and the United States grew in power and all that, none of the top 10 languages regressed in the number of speakers. That is true of Spanish, that is true of French, that is true of Russian, of German. Imagine the catastrophes that those two languages went through. And none of these languages, and in fact, the world is organizing right now around a number of 10, 12 large international languages, English being in a category of its own. And then you have Spanish, French, Portuguese, in that other German, in that other level. And it's organizing around that.
There's also the question of education increasing, which is another main tool for the spread and reinforcement of languages. And as populations become more educated, the languages become stronger, and it's their mother tongue that will become stronger because of that, not their second language. So again, I don't have statistics on Spanish. We're a little bit more familiar with what's going on in French.
Right.
But the more important education comes and the stronger education systems become, the better it is for the language.
But
Interesting.
there's a very conscious effort on the part of the intelligentsia in Spanish to unify the language.
Mhm.
When the Spanish Empire collapsed in the 1830s and throughout the 19th century, their big obsession was that Spanish would become the new Latin, that it would explode into different vernaculars that would be unrelated. And they made a conscious effort to create ties between those languages. And of course, they didn't expect the creation of telenovelas and, that's 19th century stuff, internet and all that. But even prior to the creation of those ideas, they already had created an intellectual framework to unify the culture around a certain standard. And that is a very, very strong idea. So even if Spanish goes in all sorts of directions, there's also always that drive to bring it back to a common idea or
Mhm.
ideal. So it's
Interesting.
interesting that it will progress. It will hit walls in some places, and catastrophes will happen. But that idea that there's a pan-Hispanismo, is a very strong one and an old one, almost 2 centuries.
I see both of you as being very optimistic about the future of the language, and it's a great sign, and for people like me who earn their living through Spanish, and not just earning my living, but a genuine passion for the and love for the language that I have. Um, I have a question which is not part of the list of questions that I sent you, but I would like your opinion on this. That we are living increasingly in a world of fundamentalism, and especially right-wing fundamentalism in many countries. If I talk about my own country, there is the current ruling dispensation in politics is fundamentally a right-wing party, and
Mhm.
they have been sort of clamping down on, not exactly clamping down on foreign languages, but uh, rather they are very much in support of strengthening regional languages, and the spread of regional languages and use of regional languages in schools and even universities. And there is this perception or a threat that the government would probably be sort of phasing out foreign languages. So in India, we have German, Spanish, French, which are taught and learned in schools and universities, even Italian and Korean and Japanese, a lot of other languages that are coming up now. Um, and the right wing sort of governments are there in many other parts of the world as well. So how do you see the role of politics in terms of foreign languages in different countries? Would you have
Good question.
any opinion on that?
That's a very good question. I haven't really given it a lot of thought. I mean, in our own situation here in Quebec, we have a right-wing government that is promoting French at the expense of the English minority, so I suppose it's something of a reflex to try and cast out of right-wing governments to try and cast out any kind of, and I'm not making the equivalent with the situation in Quebec. On another note, it is a reflex of them to want to cast out whatever's foreign, from, and we're going to see that in the United States for sure. But that's really an interesting question. So far, we're not experiencing that in Canada. I think that language departments in universities are probably not in the best situation right now because of the focus and budgets, from what I know, um, you know, being pushed towards science, technology, math, and those kinds of subjects, I think. But I'm speculating. I don't really know.
I think it depends on the situation of the country. I mean, for example, the arrival of Trump in the United States is probably going to be bad for Spanish in the United
But
States.
it's probably going to be bad for a lot of foreign languages in the United
But
States, I think. No?
for example, I don't think, for example, that a right-wing or socialist government at the head of Spain
Mhm.
has been detrimental to the efforts of their cultural diplomacy. Partly, I would say, because as I said earlier, they see themselves as in competition domestically with another culture, which is Catalan.
Mhm.
And I think that they're very much into demonstrating how great Spanish is domestically.
Well, that's what's going on with French here. I mean,
Yeah.
French in Quebec is seeing itself as in direct competition with English. So there is more effort to affirm French, but at the expense.
Yes, but oddly enough, for example, the Quebec government is not very.
It's not very smart.
Doesn't have a lot of connection with the francophonie, which is very odd. But
no,
anyway,
cutting French courses for immigrants and so on.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's all the. I don't know. It's kind of a mess, and I would say that the average right-wing movement is not particularly enlightened about the importance of language, even as an economic tool. Like it is, and it should be seen that way. And I think you can give a lot of credit to Spain and to France and honestly to the English language as well for recognizing the economic potential of language, and I don't really see why politicians don't understand the economic advantage of everybody learning lots of foreign languages too, because it seems pretty self-evident.
Very odd.
It seems very self-evident that if you want to have an economy, if you want to have Spanish companies investing in India, that you have to have people who are going to speak it, and that goes for Mandarin or whatever, but I think it's interesting. It's a good question that you're asking. I mean, how we will be seeing with this wave of right-wing populist governments in the next years. We will have one in Canada too. We're expected to have one, our next government as well. We'll see what that does. But yeah, very good question.
Great. My final question, and probably we have touched upon it a bit, but if anything more that you'd like to add. So do you believe that technology and globalization will unify or further diversify the different dialects of Spanish?
Good question.
Well, there's that drive for Panispanismo.
Yeah.
But at the same time,
yeah, it's hard to say. One thing I think is going on that's really interesting is that we all have access to so much cultural production now that we see stuff translated from foreign languages that takes off in like Money Heist, but like a lot of stuff from the Asian market, the whole Korean K-pop phenomenon and all that. There's so much that you can do with any language, big or small. It's a little hard to believe that we're all going into a situation where there's going to be like 2 or 3 mega languages. I just don't see it happening. The production, the potential for people to come out of nowhere with interesting stories and bring them to a global audience is just so much bigger now than it was 20 years ago. I'm hopeful about it if the governments wake up and understand that they have to like encourage and foster that kind of thing. But it's anybody's guess. It's a big question. It's a good question.
The thing that's new with technology is that, especially all the social media, is that, but internet as well and the web, is that it has democratized publishing.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of right now what's coming together, what's appearing in all languages is various registers of written language.
Mm-hmm.
Like there used to be an idea that when you wrote with a pen with ink, and you had to be very careful about what you wrote, and it had to be edited, and there was a certain sacralization of the writing. And now people write pretty much like they talk. So there's different registers of talking, and there's now different registers of writing.
Like they text now.
They write with
no, but for real. Like, but you're absolutely right. Like it's like everything they write like text, they write with AI. They write,
So that's a very interesting centrifugal element coming out of a technology that you would think would federate and unify things, and is actually creating differences. And then after that, it's all politics. It's all politics between groups, who imposes the standard, who imposes what's the new norm. Social norm will drive language. Language will drive social norm.
Yeah.
If history of the world, languages will go through as a dialectalization, any language over time, I would say, and will evolve.
Definitely English is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I would say Spanish has tools to hold it together better than English, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yep, it's true.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I would say.
Great.
Better than French in some ways too.
Yeah.
All
Great.
right.
Well, thank you so much. It's been a fascinating experience and chat with you both, Joe and Julie. It's been a learning for me as well, and I would recommend everyone once again to please go through this wonderful book to learn more about the history of this beautiful language. And I hope you've all enjoyed listening to Jean and Julie, and as much as I have done. And I hope Jean and Julie, you both have also enjoyed this conversation.
Yes,
Very
it
much.
was very
And
much.
and we've learned things too, so it's
Yes.
great.
Yeah, and a great occasion to think about it and to rethink the topic.
Yeah. Thanks so much for
Great.
having us.
Thank you. Thanks to you. And thanks to my listeners. Muchas gracias por escuchar esta entrevista tan fascinante. Hasta el siguiente capítulo de Español por Dentro. Chao.
Ciao.
Ciao.